In 2006, director Alfonso Cuaron and star Emmanuel Lubezki gave the world a dark look at the future bereft of children.
I love that, dude. In 2021, we take a break from our tour through Buffalo Trace to try a highly allocated Heaven Hill product.
You're the worst. The film is Children of Men.
The whiskey is Elijah Craig 18-year.
And we'll review them both. This is
The Film and Whiskey Podcast. Welcome to the Film and Whiskey Podcast, where each week we review a classic movie and a glass of whiskey. I'm Bob Book.
I'm Brad G.
And this week we are looking at the 2006 Alfonso Cuarón film, Children of Men. Brad, I have been waiting for this week for a long, long time. Children of Men, I am just going to come right out and say it. One of my favorite films of the 21st century. I don't even care if you don't like it. I'm just so excited to talk about it. I didn't want to put it on the schedule too soon, but also it's kind of getting to the point where I was like, all right, I think we should get around to it now. We have a lot of directions we can go. I guess I just want to turn it over to you immediately. First thoughts on the movie, first thoughts on this as our episode for the week.
I mean, there's so many ways you could go with this movie, Bob. There's just so many different descriptions you could give it, but I just have to go with meh.
All right, that's our episode for the week, folks. We will see you next week.
Yeah, next week we will have our regular scheduled episode. Super pumped, Bob.
All right, so let me ask you this. I have immediate questions because I'm just Brad. You know that
Bob. I would say I'll say this. I'm not going to give scores, but I would give this a very high score on cinematography, on the score, on the direction of the film, and probably a medium to just above average score on the acting and the dialogue. But overall, this is a gosh darn gorgeous movie.
All right, well, we'll start there, and then we'll move into how you're wrong about everything else. So,
dude, Julianne Moore can't deliver a line in multiple breaths. She rushes every single thing she says. She's like, Clive Owen, I love you so much, and we need to get this girl to the place, and it's gotta happen right away. And here's $5,000. Does that sound good? I'm like, whoa, girl, just take a breath.
That's so funny. All right, man. Listen, let me give some context here. It's been a rough day for me. We were just talking before we recorded. I am just in a weird, vulnerable, emotional spot. And I had a feeling, because it seems like the movies that I hold dearest, the ones that I really, really want you to like, always end up being the ones that you're like, meh. And honestly, I think it hurts worse when you're meh about it than when you're just like, what the hell is this? Like, I would almost feel better if you were like, well, that sucked. But it's
2 out of 10.
It's the fact that you're like, yeah, I recognize how some people could like it, but I don't. And I think that's where I'm just like, ugh.
I will say, after giving Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind a 2.5 out of 10, I can guarantee you would prefer me to be meh about a movie.
Well, I don't think it's a secret for me to say at this point, I like this a lot better than Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. A few years ago, I did my rankings of best movies of the century. This was, in my opinion, the best movie of the century up to this point.
Really?
Yeah. And watching it today, I'm like, all right, maybe not the best movie of the century, but certainly in my top 5 still. This is about as close to perfect as a movie can get, Brad, for me. And I have a lot to say. Hopefully, you have a lot to say as well to defend your viewpoint.
Yeah, I mean, I get it, dude. I understand long days, and I understand that, my opinion just means a lot to you. So, I mean, honestly, if it would help you at all, I do have a final score in mind, and I don't think it's going to hurt you too badly.
Well, Brad, I don't want our listeners.
Do you want to know it?
No, I don't want our listeners to exit prematurely. So let's hold on to the final scores.
You don't want premature exitation.
Podcast us, interrupt us. We don't want that. All right. So let's take a step back here. Let's move into Brad Explains. So Children of Men is a movie that I have a feeling some of our listeners may not have seen. It was a movie that kind of It didn't get a huge release at the time, but it was Alfonso Cuaron. And so after a few years' time kind of sitting on store shelves at the video store, it gained a really huge reputation. It was always beloved by critics, but I think now that Cuaron has become a little bit more, not mainstream, but recognized in the mainstream, people have gone back and watched this since then. So I think we're going to have a mix today, Brad, of people who have seen it, people who may have heard of it but haven't seen it yet, and people who may have never even heard of the movie. So I'm excited for Brad Explains. This is the part of the podcast where Brad breaks down the movie he has just seen, often for the first time. And this was the first time Brad saw Children of Men. So, as you know, Brad has 60 seconds to break down the plot of this movie for our listeners. Brad, do you think you can do it in a minute's time?
Dude, forget Brad Explains for a second. I will give this movie credit where credit's due. This is hands down the best apocalypse, the most unique apocalypse that caused a post-apocalyptic movie world. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Like hands down, this is one of the smartest, most interesting apocalyptic venture in the premise. In the film. Yeah, the premise is bonkers amazing. So I'll give you that, man. I just absolutely love the story as it's written.
All right, man. Let's do it. 1 minute on the clock. Right. Break down the plot.
In a world where women are 100% infertile, everything has gone to shambles. The world has fallen apart. It seems that the only country in the world that has maintained any semblance of order is Great Britain. But it is a terrible place to live if you are not British. There's a large war between refugees that have come in and the British population. And the story focuses on a man named Theo, who used to be an activist, a political activist. He is called back into this world by his former wife, Julian. She tries to get him to take a young girl to the coast. He eventually finds out that this young girl is pregnant, that she is the first girl pregnant in 18 years. And there are rebels that are trying to use her baby for their cause. The government is going to try to take her baby and probably do crazy, weird experiments on her and the baby. But that's it. That's the movie.
That's the first time you've actually run into the buzzer in quite a while here.
Yeah. It's a good movie, man.
All right, man. I want to break down the movie because I don't know if I would call this an out and out sci-fi movie, but in the strictest definition of the terms, it is a sci-fi movie. The premise is science-based, and it is a fictional movie set in the near future. But I think probably a more accurate term for this kind of movie is dystopian.
Yes.
It's obviously the opposite of a utopia. The world has devolved into shambles. And I think, Brad, that where I want to start here is I'm not usually a fan of dystopian kind of literature or movies. I think a lot of times they just think that it looks cool and they lean into the aesthetic of the dystopian thing, or it can be really nihilistic for the purpose of being nihilistic. They're always downers. And this movie is very heavy at points, but I think that when I look at the way this movie is structured, the story it's trying to tell, I think this is dystopia done right. I don't know. I want to hear you kind of run with it because you're definitely the resident sci-fi guy on the podcast. So I don't know. Where do you fall in dystopian things in general? And then how does this fit into that?
I think dystopian movies, they really can fall into the trap that you just described, where it's more about the aesthetic of like how Earth has been destroyed. The thing that I really like about this movie is that it doesn't take you into the realm of fantasy. Like, yes, it's a fantasy to think about the world not being able to have children, but it's more of a thought exercise in what would happen if the world was denied, childbirth and children. Mm-hmm. And so in that sense, I think it's a really smart dystopian topic, if you will. And I think the other thing is it makes me think about other dystopian movies like there's one that I really like that's not like a phenomenal movie, but I think it's called In Time with Justin Timberlake and Amanda Seyfried.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Like, that is a movie that reminds me of this, where it's set in a future where things are just a little bit different than our current world. But the thing I like about it is that they're not focused on the fact that the world is different. They're focused on the humanity within it. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the important thing about sci-fi is that sci-fi, the whole point of sci-fi is to kind of give people a new lens through which to view humanity. And I think that's what this movie does really well, is it says, okay, humans can't have kids anymore. What would happen to humans? What dark sides of us would come out? But at the same time, this movie explores the ideas of what kind of humanity, good humanity, would come out. And I think by the end of the movie, you see that the way that the rebels see the baby and let them go. The residents of that apartment complex see the baby and begin worshiping it and let them go. But then the British troops see the baby and let them walk away. And there's this sense of like, in the midst of all this chaos and depravity, there's still some light and still some hope for humanity. And I think that's what this movie does extraordinarily well.
Yeah, man. I mean, look, we've all lived through a really crazy last year. And honestly, watching this movie today, I was like, wow, this seems a lot more pertinent than it even did 5 years ago. Just with things that have been in the news. And again, no matter where you fall on them politically, like, we just went through COVID as a planet Earth, and we're going through all these crises on Earth with potential climate change, and in America with the migrant crisis. And like, there are things in this movie that I'm seeing and I'm like, wow, this seems like very of the moment in a way that a 15-year-old movie doesn't usually do. And I thought about the dystopian elements of it. And I think, Brad, that the reason that it works so well in this movie is just what you said. It's how much thought they put into how would this actually play out? And I don't think that they really take the most pessimistic tack of like, what's the worst that humanity would do to each other? Or what's the best that humanity would do? They really look at it through like, what realistically do you think would happen if the premise was people are infertile? And like the way that the world has reacted over the course of 18 years, because that's how the movie starts, that the youngest person on Earth, who is now 18 years old, has been murdered. And so the world is like weeping because baby Diego is dead. And over the course of that first 15 minutes of the movie, like, you start to understand this is exactly how, especially the Western world, would react to something like this. Like, you would make a celebrity. There's a cult of celebrity around the youngest person on Earth. And the governments themselves are very secretive and consolidating power. And they would obviously not want someone new to get born because then they would lose all their power. And there's religious fanatics who are wondering, like, why does God do this to them? And there would be wars, there would be mass migration. And, even in the background of some of these scenes, you see advertisements from this company called Quietus. And Quietus is like the ethical way to kill yourself is what they're marketing themselves as. And I really love the attention to detail, especially that Cuaron has in the first, I'd say 15 minutes of this movie. Like, you really have to notice the headlines on newspapers and the clippings in people's windows and what's on the TV. And if you pay attention, it's like he doesn't have to write those things explicitly into the script, because you start to understand this is how the world has responded to the circumstances around us.
Yeah, dude. I mean, as you were talking about the way it kind of connects with our current reality, like when Michael Caine is talking about the flu pandemic of 2008, I'm like, oh yeah, we had the flu pandemic, and then we had the coronavirus pandemic of 2020. Yeah. Like that hit home, where you're like, holy crap! In 2006, when they made this movie, they were wondering like, what would happen if a pandemic hit and then infertility hit, and now we're like, oh yeah, no, we got the pandemic down. we did that part. But I will say, for me, some of the opening montage and the newspaper clippings and things like that, to me, they felt a little bit on the nose. Mm-hmm. Like we talked a little while ago about like insert shots when we were talking about Gladiator. And I feel like he has enough of those at the start of this movie where you're like, okay, I get it. Like, the world's gone to crap. And for me, the most blatant part of that was the propaganda from the British news, where they're showing all the different cities around the world falling and into crisis and all this stuff. But the British government stands firm. Mm-hmm. Like, that, to me, that at that point, I'm like, dude, I get it, Alfonso. The whole world has just gone down the crapper. Like, I got it. Let's move on into the story. And so I think for me, it just took a little bit too long to get into the story. And then Clive Owen is like, no, I'm not going to do it. but I guess I will.
But okay.
Because of money, but also because sorry, I'm getting into some of the things I don't like. His motivations were just unclear to me throughout.
So I have a couple points to make, and I'm trying to figure out exactly where to start, because I do disagree with you on this. I guess I'll start with like the pace and the structure of the movie, because I honestly didn't really notice before, but I don't think this movie really has much fat on it. Like it's under 2 hours. I think with credits, it's an hour and 49 minutes. And the point where Theo, Clive Owen's character, gets kidnapped and taken by this terrorist group called the Fishes to go see his wife. It's like at the 10-minute mark of the movie. And so like the first 10 minutes are very much like, hey, here's Clive Owen. You're going to find out that he had a wife and a kid. Here's this guy that he hangs out with, Michael Caine. And here's a bunch of stuff that's going on in the world. And now that we've gotten you accustomed to the various groups you might see, like these terrorist groups and these religious fanatics and so forth, let's get on with the plot. And the plot starts pretty darn quick. And so like, I totally agree with you that insert shots, when done wrong, they can be kind of overbearing. And we talked about that with Gladiator. I thought in this case, they were really, really smartly used because he like front loaded the movie with them. Every time you go to someone else's house, the first thing you see inside their house is this collection of their memories. They always show the pictures that are on their desk. And at Michael Caine's house, it's newspaper clippings because he and his wife were both journalists. And you find out kind of the chronology of how this, whatever you want to call it, pandemic started. And then you find out that his wife has been kind of tortured by the British government, and you see her and she's in like a catatonic state. I actually thought that, like, you're right, it's on the nose, but I think it was preferable to having two characters be like, man, I'm really sorry about that time that the British government tortured your wife. That was rough, wasn't it? So I get it. Like, no option is the best option, but I think that it was definitely preferable to have to piece it together myself than to have characters spoon feed it to me through dialogue.
Yeah, no, I don't feel like it was like overly overbearing. It just was a little bit too much for me. I can tell you, though, what was way too much for me was the 72 times that Michael Caine said amigo.
Hey, man, he's a stoner. What do you expect?
I don't know, man. I don't think I've ever heard a stoner use the word amigo.
Michael Caine, least convincing stoner of all time?
Yes.
Okay.
200%. I love me some Michael Caine, but unconvincing stoner.
I do want to go back to that propaganda thing that was playing like in the buses in London where they were talking about only Britain, soldiers on. See, I actually loved that because I think Cuaron uses those little moments for two reasons. Like, he kind of gets some very dark humor out of them, and he also is being brutally honest about the way that some of these people would be portraying themselves. Like, the British government would be trying to convince people that they're awesome and that Britain soldiers on. And you see like these very in that video clip, you see these very sunny shots of Big Ben, and it's like, yeah, Britain survives. And then they pan out the window immediately, and you see like refugees being beaten on the side of the road, and it's, you know, drab and gray outside. And it's not a funny moment, but the irony of like how we're trying to portray ourselves versus what the world really looks like. I actually thought that worked really well. And he brings it up later in the movie in a moment that you also mentioned, Brad, when this young girl, Key, has had her baby. Clive Owen's trying to like escort her out of this refugee camp that they're stuck in. And there's an uprising going on. The army, they're shooting at each other. It's this insane crossfire of like Saving Private Ryan proportions. And when they hear the cry of this baby, everybody stands still. And it's this beautiful kind of haunting, moving moment. And you have this woman vocalizing in the background. And then as soon as they're like 10 steps out the door, the shooting just commences again. And it's again, it's not funny, but it's this kind of brutal, ironic realism of like, yeah, that is exactly how humans would react. Like, we would be presented with something so awe-inspiring and, you know, something that borders on worship of like, we haven't seen a child in so long. And yet our immediate reaction after seeing it is, oh yeah, I forgot I was going to try to kill these people. And they go back to just destroying each other again. So I kind of like it when he does that. He pulls the rug out from whatever narrative the characters are trying to construct and shows us the reality behind it.
Yeah, I mean that is the beauty of this movie. He takes us to a place where we recognize the flaws and strengths of humanity, and they're just put in front of you in such a raw manner that it's just brutally honest. It is a brutally honest film, and that's the stuff I really love about it.
She belongs here. And this baby is the flag that could unite us all.
We never use this baby for political purposes.
My baby is not a flag.
Make it public!
What?
Excuse me?
You should make it public.
Well, you saw the telly. She's about to be very public.
Doesn't matter. She's pregnant.
Oh, right. And then the government will say, well, we were wrong. Fuji's are humans too.
Yeah, well, whatever's going on, whatever your political ideas are, it's irrelevant. It doesn't matter.
Oh, come on.
She needs a doctor.
You really don't
Look, the government will take the baby and parade a posh black English lady as the mother.
Nobody's taking my baby.
We all know this government would never acknowledge the first human birth in 18 years from a Fuji.
A wanted Fuji. Why don't we explain to Mr. Farron what they do to immigrants in this country?
He knows. He's seen the cages. He's not that stupid.
I'm not going to the government. You told me you would get me to the Human Project. You promised me.
All right, man. Well, thank you for indulging me and pampering me as we go along this journey, making me feel better, buttering me up. We can talk about things you didn't like, and it sounds like Julianne Moore might be one of them, so maybe let's talk about the performances here. Clive Owen is the star of this movie. Clive Owen, a guy with an interesting career. Like, I really felt like they were trying to position him for big things in the mid-2000s, and it just never really happened for him. And he's better in some movies than others, and I will say even inside this movie, I think the first half of this movie, he is not very good. And there are moments where you're like, I don't know if Clive Owen's really even a good actor, because as much as you want to kind of dump on Julianne Moore's line delivery, like, she's an incredible actress, and you can even tell that she's very in the moment in these scenes, and Clive Owen very much looks like he's just waiting for his line. Like, he's not very good at responding. He's just like blank stare until it's his turn to speak, and then he says his line, and then blank stare again. Yeah, man, I was really up and down on his performance. I don't think it takes away from the movie overall, but I do kind of wonder, what would this have been like if you had a Daniel Craig or a Jude Law or anybody like that in the movie instead?
I wish that we had Daniel Day-Lewis as Daniel Plainview, as Clive Owen playing Theo, whatever
it's
his
just
last name
the
was.
opposite of I've abandoned my child.
Yeah, yes.
I've discovered a child! I've discovered a child!
Yes. That's what we need in this movie. Oh, man. Yeah, dude, here's the thing with Clive Owen. His face doesn't move enough. It's almost like off-putting how little his face moves, even when he's speaking. And the thing is, I always struggle with this because honestly, I think Clive Owen acts in such a way that is almost more believable how a real human being would act in these situations. Like, I don't know, like
how a non-actor would be in these situations.
Yeah,
yes.
like, and so we've talked about this before. So like when we were talking about There Will Be Blood, you mentioned this idea of like, we get so enamored with these directors that we just can never attribute anything bad to them. But in reality, maybe what they were going for just wasn't working. And so there is a question for me of like, was Cuaron directing Clive Owen to be more stoic, to not portray many feelings? Or, was Clive Owen just not a great actor in this?
I think it's both,
Either
man.
way, it didn't come across well for me.
Yeah, this is my struggle with his character because he's very obviously supposed to be stoic, and he has been deadened by these personal tragedies in his life, and yet, even though that's the character, like I think it's much harder to play a stoic character effectively. So, like, I will give any actor credit who does that, but then I also think that sometimes you can try to just insert an actor that doesn't have a lot of range and try to like roll the dice and say maybe it'll come across as this like very interior wounded person, and it just doesn't work. Like, I'm thinking back to when we watched the movie Warrior with Tom Hardy and how his character, I wouldn't call him so much stoic, but definitely not a person who verbalized a lot, but he had such an unbridled rage, and you could just sense this deep hurt and rage that was driving him throughout the movie. Clive Owen, he's not motivated by rage. He's motivated by loss and grief, but that doesn't register a lot in this movie. And he comes across much more like a 1940s kind of film noir private detective type character who has no emotion on his face than a guy who is like struggling with alcoholism and lost his son. And you know what I mean? Like, I just wonder how somebody else might have delivered this kind of performance, and if you would have had a sense of those layers more than you do with Clive Owen.
Yeah, I'm 100% with you, Bob. I even think like maybe a Ewan McGregor could have been good in this role.
Oh, yeah.
And granted, I feel like Ewan is often a more lighthearted character in his movies, but man, like you get him dirty, you get him a little more grungy. I think Ewan McGregor could have been phenomenal. But I think that the other problem for Clive Owen is that when I look at Julianne Moore next to him, they just never felt believable as a broken up couple, let alone as a couple. And I just wonder if anything got left on the cutting room floor because their relationship just feels so weird. Like he says, I haven't seen you for 18 years now. And yet she like is randomly kissing him at one point. And they're shooting a ping pong ball from mouth to mouth at each other. And they're like, I just, the one time Clive Owen really shows emotion is in that car scene when they're having their weird little game of ping pong mouth pass. And it's kind of joyous with her, but they didn't earn that. Like Julianne Moore ripped him out of his life, forced herself on him for her own means, told him that he's a bum because he only came for the money. But at the same time, she was the one who knew that he needed money and used that to lure him in. So like in my mind, she deserves zero sympathy, but then he's just chuckling it up with her. And then she gets shot in the friggin' lung and dies. And you're like, okay. I guess, sure.
Yeah. So here's the thing. Like, I feel like you're just kind of complaining about everything surrounding her character. So like, is it the performance? Is it the way she's written? Is it all the scenes that she's in? Like, I can't quite pin down exactly what your complaint is right now.
I mean, I think it's primarily how she was written. I think it's how her and Clive's relationship was written. But I also, like I said earlier, I genuinely think that she can't take a breath in between lines. Like there's like 3 or 4 times. Like go back and watch her, dude. She's only in the movie for like 10 minutes. Like go back and watch her scenes. There's like 3 or 4 lines where there's like 0 pauses where a comma should be. And she just flies through the line and it just feels awkward and like bad acting to me. So for me, it was just a lot of it. I guess I'll say this. I don't think she's like horrific. I don't think it's the worst performance I've ever seen. She's not like Tommy Wiseau bad levels of acting. It just wasn't a great performance. And I think that honestly, Theo and Julian could have been cast better.
Yes, I'm definitely on team Julianne Moore in this debate, just in terms of, I think that if she had a better actor to work with and whoever played Clive Owen's character, that she was doing exactly what she was supposed to do to indicate, like, I've known you a long time. We're on bad terms. I still love you. And she did as much as she could for a character that was in the movie for 10 minutes. And I also think that what Clive Owen was given was this fully formed, very well-rounded character, and he kind of fumbled the bag on it a little bit. And I think we would like Julianne Moore better in this movie if she had a more competent leading man to play off of in the movie. So, like, even though it might seem like we should put the blame on her, I actually don't think we should. So anyway, that's my point about that. But Brad, I will give you one more piece of credit here before we go to break, and that is that if I do have one complaint about the movie, the dialogue that is in the movie is sometimes so on the nose and so eye-rolling, especially in those early scenes. And that's kind of why I prefer when the exposition is given to us in like newspaper clippings, because, you know, like Michael Caine and Clive Owen are riding around in the car together, and the way that they're talking about things is just so unrealistic. It's so unlike anything that a real person would say. Michael Caine looks out the window and he's like, the refugees. And they're showing the refugees. And he's like, they've escaped the worst atrocities that the world has to offer. And then
dude.
and then, it's like, no one says that kind of stuff. Come on, man. And then they get to Michael Caine's.
Don't you mean the Fugees?
The Fugees. And then Michael Caine, they get to Michael Caine's house and they're talking about how Clive Owen was drunk. And he's like, I think that's a hangover. And he's like, well, at least when I have a hangover, I can feel something. And I'm like,
yes.
All right, we get it. We understand your character. You don't have to spoon feed it to us that much. So I do think if there is one thing the movie's definitely guilty of, it's falling into that really heavy-handed dialogue sometimes.
Yeah. I mean, even that line, like, at least when I'm hungover, I feel something. Like, I feel like if he delivered that with like a biting sarcasm and a little bit of a smile that like hides pain underneath his, his features, okay, yeah, like you can get away with a line like that. But he didn't even feel anything about how he feels nothing. And I guess that's fine. I guess that's the character they were writing. And I guess that's where I struggle with this movie, is because if you wanted to talk about the writing in terms of the plot, in terms of the story, I'm all about it. I think this is one of the most well-written movies of all time. But when you want to talk about writing as in the dialogue and in how the characters relate to one another, I think it's pretty poor, unfortunately.
All right, man, I think this is a good place to hit pause. I'm cautiously optimistic about where your score is going to land, but it's time for us to drink some whiskey. So what do you say we try this Elijah Craig 18 year?
Let's get to it.
All right, so today we are checking out Elijah Craig 18 year. Brad, I think we could just stop right here and celebrate for a minute because we have done weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks of Buffalo Trace on this show. And finally, I give you a Heaven Hill product. Elijah Craig 18 year.
Yeah, man, we're back on top of the hill. I will say, though, I don't know if I've ever really liked any Elijah Craigs before.
You know, it's really funny. We were just having a conversation on our Discord with some of our Patreon patrons, and our friend Austin from the Bourboneering podcast said that he's going back through all of our season 1 whiskey reviews, which I was terrified to hear what he thought of those because our palates were not very finely tuned at that point. And he went back and tried Elijah Craig Small Batch, and I did the same thing along with him. And I got to tell you, man, in the last almost 3 years, Elijah Craig really has kind of fallen a bit in my book. Like, there's just something about the flavor profile. The barrel proofs tend to be a little aggressive for my taste. So I'm interested to see what an 18-year bourbon does for this particular flavor profile.
Yeah, I mean, Elijah Craig for me, I just feel like there's always... When you use the word funk, Bob, you usually seem to have something of a positive connotation for it, which will never cease to just confuse me. I don't understand how funk could have a positive connotation. So for me, when I say that Elijah Craig kind of has a funk, I do not mean it in a Bob Book kind of way. I mean like funk, like something between your toes kind of funk.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, see, I guess we can kind of jump right in here. I'll give a little bit more background and then we'll get to the nose. So again, this is an 18-year age-stated bourbon. Elijah Craig Small Batch is actually listed at 94 proof. This comes in lower than that. This is only 90 proof. So I do think that what we're going to be dealing with today, just based on that fact, Brad, is, you know, a very well-aged bourbon. And as we know, the longer that bourbon sits in a barrel, the more the oak kind of takes over. I'm expecting that they watered this down a little bit more because there is going to be such a strong oak profile here. We're dealing with a 78% corn mash bill, 12% malted barley, and 10% rye. So there's actually more barley in here than rye. Brad, I'm excited. And, you've already drank the whiskey. I'm drinking it live on air. I hope that you can explain a little bit more what you mean by funk, because I'm not quite picking up the kind of dusty old book smell I get with Willet. And that's usually what I'm talking about when I say funk.
See, dusty old book is not funk, Bob. That's just wrong.
Well, I'm pretty sure the stuff that comes from between your toes is gunk, not funk. So I think we're both wrong.
Yeah, but it's a funk. Like your feet have a funky kind of smell.
A funky gunk, sure.
Yeah, funky gunk, man. No, for me, Elijah Craig always just has this like, it's not the sourness you get on like a young whiskey, but it has this like weird sour, funky kind of note on the end of most of Elijah Craig products I've had that just turns me off to their product in general. So I'm just curious to see if we have that on this one.
So for me, I'm not getting any of that here. I really like this. I think that the malted barley is coming through pretty strong. This actually smells a little bit more like a wheated bourbon, which is hilarious because there's absolutely no wheat in the mash bill here at all. But it has that kind of softer, delicate thing going on for me. Lots of caramel. I got a little bit of peanut butter when I first poured it out, which is kind of common on Heaven Hill products for me. I mean, there's a little bit of a saline note on here for me, Brad, almost like a briny kind of thing, but I'm not getting anything that's like extra funky. I like this a lot. I'm actually going to give it an 8.5 on the nose.
Yeah, for me, I think that there's some caramel going on here. It almost has a bit of like a cream cheese note to it for me. There's a little bit of soft corn. And then for me, it kind of finishes off with like a little bit of mint on the nose.
Yeah, I can see that.
But it's an interesting nose. I'm not like blown away by it. I'll give it a 7.5.
All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and take a sip while you walk us through your own tasting notes here, Brad.
Yeah, for me, it's a really actually kind of light and mild palate. Some of that mint comes through right away for me. And then there's just kind of some swaths of caramel, a little bit of vanilla. And then like as it moves towards the finish, you can feel that oak starting to come on. But honestly, though, Bob, there's nothing here that really blows me away. I'm going to give it a 7 out of 10 on the flavor.
Yeah, this is a little disappointing. I think, first of all, it needs to be at least 94 proof. I just don't understand why you would ever release a product that's lower in proof than your flagship version and charge significantly more for it. So you're right. This is pretty light on the palate. Right at the front of your tongue, you're right. There's that pop of mint, and it's like fresh mint, too. I really like that a lot. You get some very, very subtle, generally sweet notes. I wouldn't quite call it honey sweet. I don't even know if I'd call it vanilla. It is so, so thin on the front. And Brad, sometimes we've talked about how like on our tongues, there's almost zones of the palate. And I have to say, like this went from the front of my tongue to the back of my tongue, and everything in between picked up like nothing. There was just like nothing in the middle of my palate at all. And then on the back, you're right. It was like, welcome to the oak party, man. Like it was, we talk about oak on Buffalo Trace products. This was very heavily oaked, and it got really, really smoky on the end, which is a note that I remember picking up a long, long time ago on the Elijah Craig small batch. So I'm glad I pick it up here. I think the malted barley has something to do with that. It almost has like a, not a peaty kind of thing, but it has that almost scotchy smoke to it. I don't mind that. I actually really like it as an ending note here, but I'm a little bummed at how thin the mouthfeel was and how there was like a whole zone of my tongue that this did nothing for. I'm going to give it I'll say a 7, Brad, if I'm being generous. I was going to say 6.5. I'll round up to a 7 on the taste.
Well, and when we get into the finish is where I'm right back where I don't like Elijah Craig. To me, it just has a weird funk to the finish. I don't know if it's like perhaps a little bit too oaky, but it just leaves this little bit of a sour taste on my tongue that I'm just not enjoying at all. I'll be generous and say that it's not the worst finish I've ever had, but I'm going to give it a 5 out of 10.
Yeah, this is one where I think that using the term floral really does describe it a lot. Like it's not that it smells like flowers. It's kind of what I imagine eating a flower would taste like. Like on the very end, you're right. It can kind of tip into some sourness. For me, it stays more herbal and a little sweet. It's so herbal that I can understand where you could pick up like some weird sour, grassy notes on it. You're right, man. It's not the best thing I've ever tasted. Right. I took another sip, and right on the front of it this time, it was almost like, do you remember when Kool-Aid was trying to do like Capri Suns and they were selling Kool-Aid in those packages like that you put the straw into? It kind of tasted like that.
Yeah, nah, bro. I never drank Kool-Aid as a kid.
All right, well, Anyway, it had like a Kool-Aid kind of note on the front for me. And I was like, oh, this is going to get fruity. I like it. And then again, nothing in the middle. And the back end is just like extra smoky, extra oaky. I think I'm going to penalize it more on the balance for that than I am the finish. I don't mind the finish, but I can totally see how you hate it. So I'm going to give it, again, let's go 6.5 this time. I'll give it a 6.5 on the finish.
Yeah, and balance is just a 5 out of 10 for me. The nose had some promising stuff going on. I was actually interested in what was going to happen, but then the palate was just so light. There was no viscosity, and the finish was weird and sour and not my favorite. So yeah, 5 out of 10 on the balance.
You know what? I want to be kinder to it because I think that it is still like, it's a premium product, and you can tell that it's a premium product. And I respect that they're still taking swings with it. You know what I mean? Like, this is not an inferior whiskey, but it definitely isn't well balanced. So I think I'm going to be kind of close to you. I'm going to give it a 5.5 on overall balance.
And that brings us to our value category. Robert, this is a $150 allocated product. 1 out of 10.
Oh, I see the spirit of Buffalo Trace lives on in this product.
Hey, man, I'm just saying, if you're going to put average whiskey into a bottle and charge triple digits for this whiskey.
Yeah. So
and it's allocated. It's
not
even readily available.
Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give it a 5 on value, and here's why. I don't know if I actually think it's a 5 on value. I'm pretty close to that, though. It's one of the very few 18-year bourbons on the market. If you really want to try well-aged bourbon, this is one of your only options. I mean, it's like this and Pappy and a few others. So there is a ton of overhead involved in making something like this. Like the amount of alcohol they're losing to the angel share every year. I can't imagine what the yield is out of these barrels. It's going to be pricey no matter what. I don't really think that it's super overpriced for what you're getting, just based on what has to go into the bottle. Now, I will say, if you can't get it at retail, which it seems hard to do, it's allocated, this is absolutely not worth paying any more than retail. And I think you're right, Brad. If you asked me to put down $150 on this bottle to buy it at retail, I don't like it enough that I would do that. But I do think that, like, if this sounds like your thing, if you really want to try highly aged bourbon, then asking $150 for it is not necessarily overcharging. So for that reason, I'm going to give it a 5 out of 10 on value. Brad, what are you coming out to on your final score?
I am coming out to a 25.5 out of 50.
Wow, we're actually pretty separate on this, man. I'm coming out to a 32.5 out of 50. So we are at a 50.
Bob, I think that actually happened because you continually gave it a higher score than me on every category. I could be wrong, but I think that might be the issue.
Listen, who's the one taking an accounting class here, Brad? I know how my math works.
Well, apparently you need it.
So that brings us out to only a 58 out of 100, or an average of a 29 out of 50. You know what? I'm going to recommend you try it. I'm not going to say go out and buy it, but I do think that, like, at some point in your whiskey drinking journey, if you're out at the bar and they have a bottle of this, I think it's worth trying. You need to know what happens to whiskey when you leave it in the barrel for arguably too long. And I think it's worth having the experience of drinking. Now, we were provided this sample by our friend TK Bourbon on Instagram. I'm very, very grateful to receive this sample. Brad, I'm assuming you're not going to recommend trying or buying?
Nah, dude, forget that mess. Bob, it's just not good enough.
Yeah.
Like here's the deal. I will give Buffalo Trace all the crap that they deserve for what they put out, but I will give it to them. I have not had a BTAC that I didn't like, and not just like, was mostly blown away by what they were offering. Mm-hmm. So like at the very least, they're putting good juice in the bottle. This one's just average whiskey. Like, this should be a $30 to $40 bottle of whiskey if you just tasted what was in the bottle. I understand what you're saying about overhead. I understand what you're saying about that barrel's got to sit in that place for 18 years, losing most of its product to the angels. I get it. Like, I understand why they charge this much, but if you're going to charge this much, put good whiskey in the damn bottle.
So, Brad, I was actually looking at, like, all the whiskeys we've ever reviewed in the course of this podcast. And 4 out of our top 5 rated whiskeys of all time were really expensive bottles of whiskey. And at first I looked at that and I was kind of bummed because we have kind of prided ourselves for so long on being the podcast that considers value and tries to, keep in mind people's budgets and the fact that most people are not chasing bourbons like, the people we see in Facebook groups. The average consumer just wants to know if the thing they picked up off the shelf is going to be solid or not. But then I thought about it and I realized, you know what? It's okay that we have expensive bourbons and expensive whiskeys in our top 5 because one of them was not expensive. It was that Glenmorangie Quinta Reuben we love so much. But I think that there is such a thing as a really expensive whiskey that can still be a 9 or a 10 out of 10 on value. When a whiskey is that good that, you have me and Brad saying, yes, spend $500 on this, then it's a damn good whiskey. And I hear you, man. This one's good. I don't think it's $150 good. And I definitely don't think that it's like $300 good.
Yeah, dude, I think that's the frustrating thing for me on this one is that the whiskey itself is just average whiskey. And so honestly, if another company was putting out an 18-year bourbon, I think I'd be down to try it. But you tell me, Bob, if Old Granddad put out an 18-year bourbon, I'm sure that you might want to try it, but do you really think that you would like it?
No, I do not.
Yeah, exactly. There's just certain brands we like and certain ones we don't like. Elijah Craig has just never really hit the spot for me. And I will say, all this aside, TK Bourbon, what a guy. Sending us this whiskey, that is just out of this world generous, and we are super duper thankful. So I'm sorry for trashing the sample that you gave us. I genuinely, from the bottom of my heart, apologize. But 25 out of 50. 25.5 out of 50, Bob.
All right. There you have it. Elijah Craig, 18-year. Brad, what do you say we get back into talking about Children of Men?
Let's get to it.
All right, that was Elijah Craig, 18-year, a whiskey that kind of let us down. We're getting back into a movie that never lets me down.
Kind of. Bro, that was a disappointment, man.
It was good whiskey.
Yeah, it was above average whiskey.
Wow, okay. All right, Brad.
$50, Bob.
Yeah. All right, I want to jump back into Children of Men here. I think the best place to go is talk about Emmanuel Lubezki. Every time we have an Emmanuel Lubezki shot film.
Star of the movie.
Star of the movie, Emmanuel Lubezki. Brad, the first thing that his cinematography kind of aids this movie in is those super long takes. Just like in The Revenant, this movie thrives on takes that go from room to room and building to building in a way that's reminiscent of the Spielberg Oneer that we've talked about. And there are a few really classic examples. This movie has really become like a textbook for that kind of cinematography. But the very first one is the first shot of the movie. You open inside this coffee shop with people looking at a TV screen. Clive Owen kind of wanders in and is indifferent to what's happening on TV, gets his coffee. The camera follows him outside. He stops to fill his coffee with some booze. And then the coffee shop that he just came out of explodes behind him. And it's all done in one shot. And the way that this movie so seamlessly integrates the CGI, the digital components of some of these shots and the practical effects, it's truly mind-blowing. And it also, like that opening, Brad, it's probably 2 minutes long. And after that thing explodes, it just cuts to black and says Children of Men. And the note that I took down was just, holy shit, that opening. It's such a good way to just immediately get you oh, all right, I'm on board now. I don't know what's happening, but that got my attention. And without Emmanuel Lubezki's cinematography, that wouldn't have had such an impact.
Yeah, dude, as I was watching that scene, there's probably about 4 or 5 other long form scenes where he just follows, Clive Owen and the other actors. For me, it really set the stage for movies like Birdman and like 1917.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
There were so many points of watching this movie where I go, oh my gosh, like this is the forefather to trying to shoot a movie in one long continuous scene. And I thought it was impressive. I thought it was amazing. I mean, when Clive Owen is running through the war-torn refugee camp, and the camera just stays over his shoulder, it's stunning. It's graphic. It is violent. It doesn't let you turn away from what humans have done to one another. And I think that's when long scenes are most effective. We talked about this with Birdman, that like when Emma Stone and Michael Keaton are fighting with one another and the camera won't leave the room, like in most dramas, the camera would leave and you wouldn't have to sit with the awkwardness and the discomfort that Michael Keaton is having to sit with. But because the movie refuses to ever leave a scene, it forces you to face that human emotion. And I think you see the same thing here. When you force the audience to sit and watch the devastation that is wrought upon humans by other humans, it doesn't allow you to escape. And it makes you reckon with the fact that when things go wrong, when you're in a dystopian future, maybe humanity's not as good as we thought it is.
Yeah.
And I think the power of cinematography there is what really draws that message out.
Yeah. The two other really big shots in the movie are the one that's inside the car when Julianne Moore gets shot, because that's like a 3-minute shot, and it's really cool. You should look it up on YouTube of how they shot that sequence, because it's really like 5 or 6 shots that are very carefully pieced together. That shot's incredible. And then, the kind of the piece de resistance, I guess, is like that ending sequence where you follow him into that kind of tenement building to rescue Key and get back out. And, people are getting shot left and right and things are exploding. And just to think about the kind of things they had to time up with the way how much rehearsal went into that for the camera to come around the corner and things are immediately exploding. And there's, the happy accident of like the blood spatter getting on the camera lens. It's just like, it's such a cool touch that was unintended. And, it reminded me a lot of Saving Private Ryan. I think I've already talked about that, but some of these sequences where they're getting shot at and having to dive behind things, it was really, really reminiscent of Saving Private Ryan. And then some of the other sequences, like where they're mistreating these refugees, it was really, really reminiscent of some of that handheld cinematography in Schindler's List. What Lubezki does in this movie is just absolutely impeccable.
Yeah, dude, I thought the way that they used the cages to kind of as a callback to the Holocaust, the way that they had these illegal immigrants on trains and on buses, like they use so many different iconography from real human history that it just makes you go in your own heart. You just go, yeah, like this could happen. I could 100% see this happening. And so, yeah, I'm with you, man. The cinematography in this movie, like Lubezki, I'm just going to start saying it. Lubezki is the star of every movie he's in.
I think for good or for bad. Sometimes it calls too much attention to itself, but I think in this movie, it really, really works. I will say, though, before we just keep heaping praise on Lubezki, what Cuaron is doing with this movie is, I think, pretty incredible as well. And that goes as far as like some of the pieces of art I think he's referencing in this movie. We talked about this with Shutter Island. I think we've shared some things on our Discord. That really great shot of Leo DiCaprio's dream sequence where he's like holding Michelle Williams and it looks like that painting, The Kiss by Gustav Klimt. And we're like, wow, Scorsese, so cool. And then in this movie, when Key first reveals her pregnant belly to Theo, it really reminds me of that painting. Man, I think it's is it Botticelli? Like the painting where she's standing in like the clamshell with her pregnant belly. And I'll post it in Discord, but it's like one of the most famous paintings of all time. There's just so many callbacks to really famous pieces of art throughout this movie. And I think it's done in such an unpretentious way that it's like, I think that's one of the major feats here, is that this movie never seems condescending. This movie never seems stuffy or pretentious. It works at the most basic level, which is like an escape. Like we have to get to sea, and there's action thriller elements going on as well. But then it also works on such deeper levels too.
The Birth of Venus is what you're.
That's the one. Is it Botticelli?
Yeah, that is Botticelli.
Boom!
Good job, man.
Thank you very much.
Art history. You
Didn't
even know what you were getting in for here, Film Whiskey Nation. Yeah, dude, I'm with you, man. I think that once you get past the acting performances in this movie, and once you're about 30, 40 minutes into the film, the rest of it is a nearly perfect movie. Aside from Clive Owen being completely emotionless and whoever the actress is for Key, not great. There's a little bit of work there to be done, but that's okay. The rest of the movie really puts what Lubezki is doing on performance. And I think that Cuaron moves the camera in such great ways. He directs the story in so many different little nuanced ways that, yeah, I'm in, man. I'm with you from the 30-minute mark on to the end. It's a brilliant movie.
So before we go, I do think that it's necessary to at least touch on the fact that I think this movie can go as deep as you want it to. There are some very, very obvious, overt references to like the nativity here, right? I mean, it's not a one-to-one comparison, but the way that these people are seeing the arrival of this baby, it's very reminiscent for Christians especially.
Yeah, it's their savior.
Yeah, and I do think that even from like my own internal sermon illustration preparation, when you see them, like when you see him kind of dragging her almost up the steps to go into this like run down place to deliver this baby, it is so reminiscent of the story of Jesus's birth. And you know, I'm watching this movie today and I had Christmas carols running through my head of the hope and fear of all the years are met in thee tonight. And I was, Brad, like, as a Christian especially, I have a really visceral connection to this movie. It makes me feel very vulnerable, and I was very emotional at times watching this movie. When that birthing sequence happens, like, whether or not you're a religious person, whether or not you are interpreting this as kind of a metaphor for the nativity, like just on the movie's own merits and in the story it's telling, it's one of the most beautiful, breathtaking, cathartic moments of movie making I think I've ever seen.
Dude, I cried.
Yeah.
Like, I just watched my baby girl get born 9 months ago, and when they were showing this little girl get born, you get sucked into the world of this dystopian future. And you're just like, holy crap, like, this is the first child to be born in 18 years. And like, honestly, I don't think I would have seen this movie in the same way had I watched it 1 year ago. Like, the fact that I have my own child now made this movie vastly more impactful than it would have been before.
Oh, I'm in the exact same place. You know, when they are walking through the halls as it's just quiet and people are like reaching out to grab this baby's foot even. And even, again, some of the little directorial things like Cuaron, I don't know if you got through any of the end credits, but what he does is just white titles on black background and the sound of children's laughter throughout the entire credit sequence. It's such a perfect touch because you haven't heard that through the whole movie, and it's what the whole world has been missing. I love this movie. I think it's a perfect movie. I understand that some of the performances might not be up to par, but like the movie making so overwhelms any little qualms that I could have about the movie. This is a 10 out of 10, man.
So I guess I'll say a few things. I think that the color palette for this movie is super bland. And that's kind of a struggle for me. I think that something like There Will Be Blood is a little bit more interesting. That it just feels like there's something nicer going on with the coloring in that movie. And I feel like the cinematography is somewhat similar. And it's just breathtaking. So for me, the movie just kind of felt washed out. And that's why I'm not quite as big on the cinematography. But Bob, I'm not crazy far off from you, but I don't know, maybe in Film and Whiskey standards I am. I'm going to give it an 8.5 out of 10. I think that this is an amazing movie. It's one that I want to watch again. But from the corniness of Michael Caine's performance, although I guess I'll shout out Michael Caine. When he goes up to Luke, the rebel leader, and offers him his finger, that whole sequence, that's like prime peak Michael Caine. Am I right? Like just, oh man, that was such a great scene. But yeah, with how corny Michael Caine was, with how lifeless Clive Owen is, with how bad of an actress whoever plays Key is, there's just too much going on here for me to give it a 9 or a 9.5 out of 10.
I respect it. I don't see how anyone could ever give this less than a 9.5, but like, I'll take what I can get at this point. I will say, Brad, for those of our friends out there who don't really want to watch movies at a very deep level, I do think this movie has a lot to offer, just in like a, hey, do you get it department? Because his name's Theo, and Theo is like, you know, God, right? He's struggling with his relationship with Faith, so his name's Theo. Get it? Her name is Key. Do you get it? Because she's the key to everything. She's the key to humanity. Do you get it? So I think there's a lot of little moments in this movie where if I'm watching it with someone, I could, you know, give them the old elbow to the ribs and say, yeah, you get it?
See it? I just felt like Key was the most obvious Virgin Mary reference that I've ever seen in a movie.
He and Scorsese could have some really good conversations about their faith and Catholic guilt and everything else.
Yeah, that'd be amazing. What would a Cuaron / Scorsese co-directed film look like?
I want to see it. That's all I have to say about that.
Get Lubezki on the camera.
Oh. All right, we want to know what you think about Children of Men. Have you seen it? Have I hopefully convinced you to go see it? And that means you're ignoring Brad's 8.5 here. Reach out to us. Let us know what you think of the movie. You can find us.
Bob, I don't think an 8.5 is going to stop somebody from seeing it. Be like, well, I kind of trust Bob, but Brad, he gave it an 8.5. I'm never watching that
Yeah,
film.
but here's the thing, though. You started out the episode with, my overwhelming word for the movie is meh. So, like, for people who didn't hang with us for the full hour, I don't think that they walked down the street thinking, like, I bet he gave that an 8.5.
Yeah, they'll probably see it on Instagram, though. They'll be like, oh, wow, maybe I should go back and listen. I didn't think he was going to give it an 8.5.
Well, speaking of Instagram, you can find us there and on Facebook and on Twitter at Film Whiskey.
Or if you'd like, you could leave us a voicemail on our website, which is anchor.fm/filmwhiskey.
I'm Bob Book.
I'm Brad G.
And we'll see you next time.